On your knees, Omega." The voice cut through the noise of the crowded hall, the way a knife cuts through linen, clean, practiced, indifferent to the damage it left behind. Naira heard it and did not stop moving. She carried 3 flagons of dark ale in her left hand, the handles pinched between fingers she could no longer feel at the tips from the cold that seeped through the stone floor into her bare feet, and a platter of roasted root vegetables balanced against her right forearm, and she crossed the last 4 steps to the long table without spilling a drop or shifting a single parsnip from its arrangement. She set the platter down. She set the flagons down. Then she turned to face him. Kale, the beta of the Ashvale pack, was 28 years old, broad through the shoulder, and dressed in the black and silver livery of the Alpha King's traveling retinue. He had arrived at the inn at the village of Edenmere 2 hours before sunset, with 11 riders, all of them armed, all of them accustomed to a particular quality of deference from the people they passed through. He sat now at the head of the long table with the loose, entitled ease of a man who had never in his life been told to wait for anything. He was looking at Naira. "I said kneel," he said. "Waitresses in the King's Hall serve from the floor. Old custom." "You will observe it." There was no old custom. Naira knew every custom of service that had ever passed through any hall between Edenmere and the capital, and there was no such rule. She knew this the way she knew most things, quietly, precisely, and without telling anyone she knew it. The other riders watched. 2 of the men near the fire had already turned, sensing sport. Naira looked at Kale for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to let him see that she had heard him, long enough to let the room hear the silence that followed. Then she went down, not with the stumbling, humiliated descent he was angling for. She dropped to one knee with the economical precision of a soldier taking a command position, weight perfectly centered, spine straight, chin level, right fist pressed flat against her sternum, and then extended outward and down in a single controlled arc. The old gesture, the commander's salute, the one given by field officers of the Ashvale Northern Garrison to acknowledge an order they considered beneath a response. It said, without a single word, "I have heard you. You are beneath answering." The fire crackled. One of the riders near it made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and then stopped making it when Kale's head turned. Kale's jaw tightened. "Where did you learn that?" Naira rose from the floor in the same controlled movement, smoothed the front of her apron with both hands, and reached for the empty flagon at the far end of the table that needed refilling. "From a soldier," she said. She walked back toward the kitchen. That had been 20 minutes ago. The trouble, she knew, was not over. 3 years. She had worked the floors of the Edenmere Waystation Inn for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had learned that trouble arriving on horseback and wearing silver-trimmed livery was the specific kind that did not let things lie. She had hoped the northern posting would be far enough from the capital that she would not see this particular face, this particular retinue, this close to the particular date that was now only 11 days away. She had been wrong, as it turned out, about the distance. She refilled the flagon. She steadied her breathing against the cold iron of the tap. 11 days. She could last 11 days. She had to. She went back out into the hall. 3 years ago, she had not been a waitress. That was where the story actually began, though the beginning felt, now, like something that had happened to a different person in a different century, and not like the truth of her own life at all. 3 years ago, she had been Naira Solon, third daughter of a garrison commander in the Ashvale Northern Territory, raised on military order and precision and the habit of competence kept very quiet so that the men around her would not be made uncomfortable by it. Her father had taught her the salute she had just used on the beta. He had taught her tracking, field medicine, the caloric mathematics of provisioning a column of 300 soldiers through a mountain winter, and the names of every pack law that governed the territory from the High Reach to the southern lowlands. He had not taught her how to be an Omega in a world that had very specific expectations of what Omegas were for. She had figured that part out herself. The designation had come late for her, 17, 2 years past the average, which some of the other girls at the garrison school had taken as proof that the moon itself was reluctant to assign her anything, and when it came without the softness that the stories promised. No sudden sweetness to her scent, no instinctive pull toward hearth and pup-rearing and deference, just a quiet biological reclassification that rearranged every room she walked into, from one where she was taken seriously to one where she was not. Her father had adapted to it with the flexibility of a man who had seen harder things. Her brothers had not. The garrison had not. She had, because she had no other option, and because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that the terrain beneath your boots was the only terrain that mattered, not the terrain you wished for, not the terrain the maps promised, but the actual ground, the real distance, the true weight of what you were carrying. What she was carrying for the past 3 years was Pell. Pell was not her son. That was the first thing she would have said to anyone who asked, except that no one had ever asked, because no one in Edenmere looked at her closely enough to ask anything. Pell was the son of her dead brother Davin, killed in the border skirmish that had also killed her father 18 months before she came to Edenmere, and of Davin's dead mate, Sarah, who had not survived the birth. Pell was 14 months old when Naira took him from the garrison's holding house, where the pack law said orphaned pups of unmated Omegas were remanded to state care after 30 days, unless a blood relative with verified status could claim them. She had claimed him. She had walked out of the garrison with Pell wrapped against her chest and a single pack on her back, and enough coin for 3 weeks of travel, and she had walked south, and then east, and then south again, and she had not stopped until she reached Edenmere, which was far enough from anyone who knew her name that the name would not follow her. She had found work at the inn within 2 days of arriving. The innkeeper, a woman named Bress who smelled of wood smoke and old wool, and had eyes that missed nothing, had looked at Naira for a long moment and then said, "You know how to move quietly, and you know how to carry things without breaking them. That's enough for me." She had asked no questions about Pell. For that alone, Naira had been grateful enough to stay. The inn's back room, behind the kitchen and above the cold storage, was 6 feet by 9 feet. Naira had measured it with her feet on the first morning. It held a pallet, a small iron brazier, a wooden box that functioned as both a storage chest and a table, and Pell's sleeping basket, which Naira had woven herself from willow reed she had gathered at the creek 2 fields east of the inn, because basket weaving was one of the skills she had picked up in the garrison infirmary, and it cost nothing but time, and time, in the slow hours between the inn's last seating and its first morning fire, she had. Pell was 4 now. He slept in the basket still, because he was small for his age. He had been a fragile infant, and the first winter in the back room had tested him in ways that Naira did not let herself think about for too long, because the thinking cost something she could not afford to spend. He was sturdier now. He had her brother's dark eyes and his mother's fair hair, and he had recently developed the habit of collecting small stones from the inn's courtyard and arranging them in patterns that Naira recognized as having a logic to them, though she had not yet worked out what the logic was. 11 days. The Alpha King's formal census riders would reach Edenmere in 11 days. The census was a pack law requirement, conducted every 5 years, and it catalogued every wolf in every settlement within the territory's boundary. It catalogued designations. It catalogued bloodlines. It catalogued unmated Omegas and their dependents. It would catalogue Pell, and Pell's bloodline, her brother's bloodline, her father's bloodline, carried a marker that Naira had spent 3 years hoping no one in Edenmere would ever have cause to run through a registry. The marker was not a secret she had manufactured. It was a truth she had simply refrained from announcing, which was not the same thing, or so she had told herself on every one of the 1,095 mornings she had woken in that 6x9 room and looked at Pell's sleeping face and decided, again, to stay quiet. The marker was this: Pell's grandfather, her father, the garrison commander, had been the last surviving brother of the previous Alpha King's bonded mate, which made Pell, by the bloodline charts that the census writers carried, a collateral of the royal line, minor, distant, but not invisible, not to the kind of people who showed up in black and silver livery and made waitresses kneel as sport. This was why, when Cale's retinue had ridden into Edenmere's yard that evening, Naira's hands had gone very still on the tray she was carrying, and she had counted the horses, and she had counted the days, and she had gone back into the kitchen and told Pell, who was sitting on the flour sack in the corner, drawing patterns in spilled meal, to go upstairs to the back room and stay there until she came for him. He had gone without argument. That was one of the things about Pell that sometimes made her chest ache, with a feeling she had no name for. He trusted her completely, the way small animals trust the ground beneath them, without evidence and without question. She had not earned that trust in any dramatic way. She had simply not left. Now she was back in the hall, and Cale was watching her cross the floor with the refilled flagons, and the men near the fire had arranged themselves into the quiet, attentive posture of people waiting to see what happened next. "The girl with the soldier's salute," Cale said, as she set the flagons on the table. "Sit down." "I'm working," Naira said. "Sit down," he said again, and this time there was something in it that was not sport anymore, something that had sharpened, the way a blade sharpens when it finds the stone. "I want to know your name." Naira set the last flagon down with a sound that was quieter than she intended, and looked at him across the table, and understood, with the part of her mind that her father had trained to read terrain, that the 11 days she had been counting on had just become something much less. "Naira," she said, "I work for Bress." "Naira," he repeated. He let it sit in the air between them. "And how does Naira come to know an Ashvale garrison salute?" "My father served," she said. "Old territory, you wouldn't know the post. Try me." She said nothing. Cale leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his fingers laced together, and he looked at her, the way surveyors look at ground they mean to acquire. "We'll be here 3 nights," he said. "I'll have questions. I'd like you to be available to answer them." "I'll be serving," she said, "same as tonight." She went back to the kitchen. She put her back against the cold stone wall beside the bread oven and breathed in the smell of yeast and char, and the thin metallic edge that meant the temperature outside was dropping below freezing again. She thought about Pell upstairs on the pallet, small and warm and unaware, drawing his patterns in the dark. She thought, 11 days was always too long to hope for. She thought, then I have tonight to figure out what comes instead. She straightened up from the wall. She picked up the next tray. She went back out. The second day was quiet in the way that pressure is quiet, accumulated and invisible until it is not. Cale's men ate breakfast in silence and rode out toward the village's eastern boundary to inspect the grazing territories the way the traveling retinue always did when it stopped somewhere, which Naira recognized as standard procedure, not particular threat. Cale himself remained at the inn. He sat at the table near the window that looked into the courtyard and drank his tea and watched the yard with the particular stillness of a man who had been trained to observe. Naira served him his breakfast without meeting his eyes, and collected his empty cup without meeting them either, and went back to the kitchen and began the work of the day's provisioning, which required her to go to the market at the village center for the items Bress had listed, and she calculated as she walked whether it was possible to do what she was now thinking of doing in the time she had available. It was possible. Barely. She sent Pell to the market ahead of her with a copper coin and the instruction to buy himself a sweet from the third stall and wait for her at the stone bench by the well. He went with his stone-patterned gravity, tucking the coin into his fist with both hands. She watched him go, and then turned toward the village's northern edge, where the courier station was, and went quickly. The letter she wrote at the courier station's public writing desk took her 9 minutes. She knew the address from memory. She had never written to it before, because she had never wanted to draw a line between this life and the other one, but necessity had a way of redrawing her maps for her. She addressed it to her father's oldest remaining friend, a retired field lieutenant named Ostev, who lived now in the garrison city of Vale, and she wrote, "I have something of Davin's that needs a safer house than the one I've been keeping. I need to know if you can take it without questions reaching the wrong ears. I need to know before the census riders arrive. I have 8 days." Her throat tightened as she wrote the 8. She had lost 3 already. She sealed the letter with plain wax. She paid for fastest relay courier. She went back to the market and found Pell at the stone bench with a piece of honeyed barley sugar in one hand and a new stone in the other, a flat grey piece with a white line running through it that he had apparently found in the gap between cobblestones. "Is it a good one?" she asked. He considered. "It has a road in it," he said, tracing the white line with one finger. "Roads go somewhere." She had to look away for a moment. She bought the day's provisions and walked back to the inn with Pell's hand in hers, measuring each step against the number of days she had left and the weight of the letter she had just sent into the relay, and the certainty, growing in her chest, like cold water rising, that Cale had not come to Edenmere by accident. She could not know this. There was no evidence for it beyond his presence and his questions and the way he had looked at her when she said her father served. But her father had taught her to trust the terrain beneath her boots, and the terrain beneath her boots said, "He knows something, or he suspects something, and the census is not the only mechanism in play here." That afternoon, Bress found her in the kitchen and told her quietly, without looking at her, that the beta had asked about the inn's residents. Standard census pre-survey, he had said, just noting who was resident, who was passing through, how many wolves, and what designations. "I told him I had 2 staff who board here, and their business was their own," Bress said. She still did not look at Naira. "He'll ask again. I won't give him more than that." "Thank you," Naira said. Bress made a short sound that meant the subject was closed and went back to the ledger. Naira stood at the bread oven and held both hands flat against the warm iron surface and let the heat move up through her palms and thought about what it cost another person to stand sideways against power on her behalf, and decided she would not make Bress carry that cost longer than was necessary. She went upstairs and checked Pell's basket. He was asleep, one fist curled around the flat stone with the white road in it. She stood over him for a moment and watched him breathe. Then she went back downstairs and finished her shift. On the 3rd morning, Cale did not eat breakfast at the window table. He was standing in the kitchen doorway when Naira came down at first light, and behind him were 2 of his riders, and his face had changed in the way that faces change when sport becomes something else entirely. "There you are," he said. "We found something interesting at the Northern Boundary Survey yesterday. A census pre-registry from the garrison at High Reach, 5 years old, a commander's daughter, Omega designation, 1 dependent pup, bloodline flagged for royal collateral status." He paused. Naira Solon. The kitchen was very quiet. The bread oven ticked. "The pup," he said. "Where is he?" She said nothing. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Cale said, with the tone of a man who found difficulty convenient. "The child is a royal collateral. He belongs in the capital registry. That's law. He's 4 years old. Naira said. He belongs in his bed. He belongs where the law puts him. Kale took a step into the kitchen. I'm going to need you to bring him down. She looked at him. She looked at the two riders behind him. She looked at the door behind her, which led to the back passage, which led to the stairs, which led to the 6x9 room, where Pell was still sleeping. She said no. The word came out very quiet and very flat, and with precisely no inflection, and it landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water, with more effect than its size should have allowed. Kale looked at her for a moment, as if he were recalibrating something. Then he nodded to the rider on his left. Naira moved before the rider did, not toward the back passage, toward the rider. She was not a fighter. Her father had given her the basics of field restraint, the kind of knowledge designed to let a person remove themselves from a grip rather than win a contest, and she used exactly that knowledge now, stepping inside the rider's reach as he came for her arm and twisting in a way that cost her the skin on her wrist against his bracers, but put her between him and the back door with enough of a second's lead that she could get the door closed and the bar down before he recovered. Then she was running up the stairs. Pell was awake. He was sitting up in the basket with the white road stone in his hand and his dark eyes very wide and attentive, because whatever else he was her brother's son, and her brother's son had a soldier's instincts even at 4. We're leaving, she said. Now? He said. Now. She had a pack already prepared. She had prepared it the night Kale arrived, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that you pack for the contingency you hope will not happen, not the one you expect. The pack held 4 days of provisions, a water skin, 2 changes of clothes for Pell, her father's field compass, and 11 silver coins wrapped in cloth so they would not ring against each other. She lifted it from behind the wooden box and swung it onto her back in one motion. She took Pell's hand. She went to the window. The inn's back room looked over the kitchen garden, which was enclosed by a stone wall 4 feet high, and beyond the wall was the kitchen garden's service lane, and beyond the lane was the field that ran east toward the creek. She had measured this distance too, in the 3 years she had lived here, field to creek, 600 feet, creek to the first tree line, another 200, tree line to the old shepherd's track that ran north-northeast toward the high road, 40 minutes of walking, less if she ran, less than that if she carried Pell. She lowered Pell to the window ledge. Jump when I tell you. The ground is soft. He looked at the drop, which was 8 feet, with the gravity of a 4-year-old taking a serious problem seriously. Okay, he said. Jump, she said. He jumped. She heard him land, a soft thud, then silence, then his voice. I'm good. She went out the window after him. She hit the garden dirt with both feet, and the impact drove up through her ankles and shins in a way that she noted and filed away and did not allow to slow her down. She took Pell up in her arms and ran. The creek was frozen at the edges but not the center. She waded through the center carrying Pell above the waterline, and the cold of the water rose through her feet and calves and locked around her knees like iron rings, and she did not stop moving. On the far bank she set Pell down, and they went into the tree line together, and behind them she could hear, faintly, the sound of the inn's back door being broken open. She counted steps. She counted minutes. She ran. The shepherd's track was exactly where she remembered it. It was narrow and half obscured by 3 days of new frost, and it angled northeast through the high meadow in a way that would take them off the valley road's sightlines within the first 20 minutes. She knew the landscape by feel now, 3 years of gathering from it, 3 years of watching it change through the back room's single window, and she used that knowledge now the way she used everything she knew, quietly, practically, without announcing it. Pell kept pace beside her for the first 2 miles. He was small, but he was not weak, not anymore, and he had the flat-footed endurance gait of a child who had been walked long distances since he could walk at all. When his legs finally gave out on the 3rd mile, as she had calculated they would, she shifted the pack to her front and took him on her back and kept going. The cold was serious now. The sun was an hour from the treetops and dropping, and the temperature was dropping with it, and Naira had left the inn without her heavy coat, because the heavy coat had been hanging on the peg inside the kitchen door, and she had not had the seconds needed to reach it. She had her wool-working layers, and her apron, which she tore off and wrapped around Pell's legs as she walked, because his legs were the part most exposed to the wind, and the wind had picked up from the northwest in the way it did when the high altitude began to push cold air down through the valley passes. She watched the light. She counted minutes. She thought about the courier she had sent. 8 days, she had written, and that was before this morning, so the letter had 6 days to reach Ostev before the census riders arrived, and the fastest relay was 3 days between here and Vale, which meant Ostev had 3 days to respond if she sent word of where to find her, which meant she needed somewhere to send from. There was a way station at the crest of the high road, old construction, from the garrison era, maintained now by a rotation of volunteers who were supposed to keep the fire and the provisions stocked for travelers in winter. She had no way of knowing if it was currently staffed, but it would have walls and a hearth, and, if the provisioning rotation had held, food. 4 hours of walking, maybe less, if she pushed. She pushed. The light went entirely about an hour into the high meadow crossing, and the stars came up behind the cloud cover without providing any useful light, and Naira navigated by the compass and by the feel of the slope beneath her feet, which tilted slightly north on the shepherd's track and slightly more north where the track met the high road's approach. Pell slept on her back. She could feel his weight shifting with each of her steps, the specific, complete weight of a sleeping child, which was different from the weight of a waking one in ways she could not have articulated, but knew in her spine. She did not count the stars. She counted her steps. She thought about nothing she could not use. 2 miles east of Edenmere, in the cold dark, the Alpha King's advance party made camp. There were 7 of them. They had ridden ahead of the main census convoy by 3 days, because Leander preferred, when he moved through the territory, to move without the convoy's noise and visibility. He had done it this way for the 4 years since he had taken the throne, and his traveling secretary had long since stopped arguing about the security risk and simply arranged, without announcing it, for the advance party to consist of the 6 best-trained wolves in the Royal Guard. Leander was the 7th. He was not, in the field, particularly king-like in appearance. He wore the same dark riding clothes the guard wore, without insignia, and he did not carry the seal staff or the ceremonial blade that his formal appearances required. He was fair-skinned, fair-haired in the way of old northern bloodlines, not pale but sun-warmed from years in the open, with the kind of face that kept its own counsel and gave very little away. He was taller than most of his guard, but not dramatically so, and he moved with the economy of someone who had grown up in military company and absorbed its habits without being aware of it. He sat now at the edge of the campfire, with a territory map unrolled across his knees and a cup of camp tea at his left hand, and the specific quality of stillness he got when his wolf was paying attention to something that his conscious mind had not yet identified. He had been this way for about 40 minutes. The wolf had been restless since they crossed the Valley Road's junction, not alarmed, restless, in the way it got when something on the wind didn't resolve into a recognizable category. He had said nothing about it. He continued to read the map. At the 50-minute mark, his head came up. He did not look around. He simply went still, in a way that was absolute, which was different from his previous stillness, and which made the nearest guard, a woman named Riva, who had known him since his garrison childhood, stop what she was doing and watch him. Wind from the northwest, carrying winter cold and pine resin and the distant smell of creek water. And something under all of it, something that hit the back of his throat and the roof of his mouth simultaneously, like a flavor rather than a scent, like copper sweetness being burned away by cold, like warmth pressed flat under ice, like something that had been carrying a very heavy weight for a very long time and had not put it down. His wolf said, in the silence at the back of his chest. There. Leander set the map down on his knee, very carefully. He looked at Riva. How far to the shepherd's track? He said. Riva blinked. The old one? 2 miles north. Why? He was already standing. He said, Bring 2. Leave the fire burning. He went north. He found her on the high road's approach, 200 feet below the way station crest, and this was where seeing her for the first time happened. Not in warmth, not in any prepared place, but in the dark between the trees, the moonlight coming in thin and cold through the cloud gaps, and Naira Solon moving up a frozen slope with a child on her back and a pack on her front, and her jaw set at the angle of someone who had decided some time ago that stopping was not among the available options. He stopped. He put up a hand to hold the 2 guards behind him. She had not heard them. She was moving with the complete focus of exhaustion that has found its second wind, her breath fogging in the cold, her footing on the ice-slicked track precise and practiced. The child on her back was asleep, dark-haired, wrapped in what appeared to be a torn apron against the cold. Leander stood very still and let the wind bring him what it had been trying to give him for the past hour. The scent came fully now, without the distance filtering it, not just the copper sweetness, but everything underneath, resolve and physical pain, and 3 years of keeping something safe that she had loved more than she had loved any comfort of her own. It hit the back of his throat and settled there with the weight of something permanent. His wolf did not say mine this time. It said something older and quieter than that, something that did not need a word. His hand closed at his side on nothing. He said, quietly and clearly, so as not to startle her, The way station has a fire. Naira stopped. She turned around. She looked at him in the dark, at his face, his clothing, the 2 wolves standing behind him with their hands open and visible in the guard posture of non-threat. And he saw her read all of it in about 3 seconds, the way someone reads terrain when they have been taught to, quickly and without emotion, and arrive at a conclusion. She said, "Who are you?" "Someone who has a fire," he said, "and you are carrying a child in the cold, and you are limping on your left foot, which you don't realize yet, because you've been walking on it long enough that the cold has numbed the signal." She looked down at her left foot. She looked back up at him. "Come to the way station," he said. "I'll ask your name when you're warm." She said nothing for a moment. Her arms tightened slightly around the child on her back, a reflex, not a choice. The wind moved between them. Then she said, "You're moving north with 2 guards in the middle of the night, with no insignia. You're either running from something, or you're ahead of something." "Ahead," he said. "Ahead of what?" He said, "The census." The word landed between them, and the wind moved it away, and she stood on the frozen track with the child asleep on her back, and her left foot going wrong beneath her, in ways she was only beginning to feel, and she looked at him for a long moment that had its own weight. "Why would I trust that?" she said. "You wouldn't," he said. "Not yet. But the fire is real, and your child needs it more than you need to trust me right now." He watched her decide. He watched her do it the way she did everything, apparently, practically, without visible drama, arriving at the useful answer and moving toward it. "Fine," she said. "Lead." The way station had a fire, as he had said. It was a single room, stone-built, with a central hearth that burned with the clean, hot efficiency of dry hardwood, and a stack of provisioned blankets in the supply chest that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. One of his guards had arrived ahead of them and set the fire higher and put water on to heat. The other stationed herself outside without being asked. Naira sat on the bench nearest the fire and unslung Pell from her back and settled him against her side, and he slept through all of it, the firelight and the movement and the unfamiliar smell of the place, with the total unconsciousness of a 4-year-old who has been carried far enough that the world's opinions no longer reach him. She pulled the apron wrapping tighter around his legs and then looked up at Leander, who had taken the bench across the fire and was looking at her with the kind of attention that was not rude, but was not casual either. "Naira Solon," she said. Her voice was flat. She had decided, apparently, that she had nothing left to spend on anything but the direct version. "That's my name. The child is my brother's son. His name is Pell. His bloodline will show a royal collateral flag in the census registry, and your beta has already found the pre-registry at High Reach, so I assume you know why we're on this track in the dark." Leander looked at her for a moment. "Cale found the pre-registry," he said. It was not a question. "He arrived at the inn in Edenmere 3 days ago," she said. "This morning, he tried to take Pell into custody under the collateral registry law." "Cale doesn't have the authority to invoke that law," Leander said. "The collateral registry requires my seal." Naira's eyes changed very slightly. "He didn't mention that." "He wouldn't," Leander said. "Cale has been overreaching for 18 months. I've been watching it." "Then why is he still your beta?" It was exactly the question he would have expected from her, given everything he had observed in the last 20 minutes. He said, "Because removing him required evidence, not suspicion, and he has been careful not to provide evidence." He paused. "Until now." Naira looked at him. "You're saying what happened this morning is documentable," he said. "He invoked a registry law without the king's seal. He used 2 riders to pursue and detain a resident and her dependent without warrant. He did this in his king's name." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I will need your account. In full, in writing, witnessed by my traveling secretary, who is with the main convoy and will arrive in Edenmere tomorrow morning." "And in exchange?" Naira said. He said, "There is no exchange. What he did was wrong. What I am doing is correcting it." "You're the king," she said. It came out quiet and almost flat, and with a quality underneath it that was not awe and was not fear, but was something that Leander recognized as the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing a problem alone for a very long time and had just encountered, for the first time, a force that was not working against her. "Yes," he said. She looked at the fire. Pell shifted against her side and made a small sound and settled again, and her hand moved to the back of his head automatically, the way it had been moving to the back of his head for 4 years, the way a compass moves north. "The census," she said, "Pell's bloodline. Will be registered," Leander said, "accurately, as the collateral he is, with full registry protections, which means no removal, no reassignment, and no legal claim on his care by any party other than his documented guardian." He paused. "Which is you?" She looked at him again. Something in her face had gone very careful. "You should have water," he said, "and something to eat, and your left foot needs to be looked at." "I'm fine," she said. "You're not," he said, with the same quietness he used for everything. "You have been walking on a sprain for at least 2 hours, and the cold has been masking it. I can see the angle of your weight from here." She looked down at her left foot. She looked back up at him. "I'm fine," she said again, but this time it came out slightly differently, slightly less like a statement, and slightly more like the last piece of a habit that had been serving her so long she had forgotten it was a habit. He stood up. He went to the supply chest and found the medical kit that the way station rotation was required to maintain, and he brought it to the bench and crouched on the floor in front of her and looked up at her and waited. She looked at him looking up at her from the floor, the alpha king of the Ashvale territory, crouched on a way station floor, in the firelight, with a medical kit in his hands, and something in her face shifted in a way that was not visible so much as present, the way a change in air pressure is present before the storm arrives. She lifted her left foot. He worked quietly and without ceremony, and she sat without flinching at the pressure, even when he found the point that was not numb anymore, and Pell slept on against her side, and the fire burned, and the way station smelled of cedar and dry wood, and the particular compound of cold and exhaustion, and kept silent endurance that had been moving through the wind at him for the past hour, in a way he was only now understanding the full weight of. She had been carrying this alone for 3 years, not the sprain, the 3 years, the counting of days, the measuring of distances, the letter sent to a retired lieutenant 8 days before a census that could take the child from her, the pack prepared in advance, the window, the creek, the frozen track. She had done all of it without asking anyone to help her. He tied off the bandage. He sat back on his heels. He looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and the fire made the distance between them small. "Your father's garrison salute," he said. "The one you gave my beta." Her chin came up very slightly. "The field officer's acknowledgement," he said, "given to orders considered beneath a response." "He earned it," she said. "He did," Leander said. He rose from the floor, straightening up, and stood. "I want you to know that I saw the account before I came north. Riva," he nodded toward the guard who had been outside, "was at the inn 2 hours behind Cale's arrival. She observed the exchange. She sent me word." Naira went still. She was watching. "She's been watching Cale for 3 months," he said. "You were not her target. You were not what she expected." He paused. "When I read her account, the salute, the tone of it, the precision, I came north myself. Because of a salute," she said. "Because of what it said about who was doing it," he said. The next morning came fast and cold, the sun pulling itself up over the eastern ridge in the thin, white way of deep winter, and Leander's full advance party had gathered at the way station by the time Pell woke and climbed off the bench and went to the supply chest and began systematically investigating its contents with the serious, methodical attention he brought to everything. He found a carved wooden dog at the bottom of the chest, left by some previous traveler, worn smooth from handling, and held it up for Naira's inspection with an expression of solemn inquiry. "Is that a good one?" she asked, with exactly the same inflection she had used about the stone at the market. He considered. "It goes somewhere," he said. Leander, standing at the door with the territory map, heard this exchange and said nothing, and the quality of his silence was different from any silence he had maintained before. The convoy arrived in Edenmere by mid-morning. Leander rode with his seal staff, which he had sent Riva back to retrieve from the main party's supply, and he wore the insignia he did not generally wear in the field, and he arrived at the inn courtyard in a manner that was not theatrical, but was absolutely unambiguous, and the 11 riders in Cale's retinue understood the unambiguity immediately and arranged themselves into the stiff, careful posture of men recalibrating their options very quickly. Cale was standing in the inn doorway when Leander rode in. There was a moment that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, in which Cale understood several things at once. The first was that the king had arrived ahead of the convoy, which was unusual. The second was that he had arrived from the north, which was specific. The third was that behind him, on a horse Riva had provided, sat Naira Solon with a 4-year-old on the saddle in front of her, and she did not look like a woman who had been found and returned. She looked like something else. The whole retinue could smell it. Not her designation, or not only that, something else, moving through the cold morning air, something that made 2 of the senior riders lower their eyes and take a step back without being asked. Leander dismounted. He crossed the courtyard to the inn doorway and stood in front of Cale and said, in the tone he used for things he intended to happen exactly once, "I will speak with you inside." The account was delivered in Bress's back room, Naira's own account taken first, in writing, by the traveling secretary who had ridden ahead of the convoy at a signal Leander had sent 2 hours before arrival. Then Riva's account, then the accounts of 2 other witnesses among the inn's other guests. When Cale emerged from the back room after his own interview, he was no longer wearing the beta's chain. It was not announced. It did not need to be. He carried the chain in his hand, and anyone watching could see what the carrying of it meant, and everyone watched. Bress observed this from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression, that of a woman who has made a calculated investment and is watching it return. She caught Naira's eye across the courtyard and made the short sound that meant the subject was closed. Naira was sitting on the stone mounting block at the courtyard's edge with Pell beside her, and he had his collection of stones arranged in a line on the stone surface between them, and he was adding the carved wooden dog to the end of the line, and explaining something about it to himself, in the low, focused voice he used when he was working out a system. Leander came out of the inn and crossed the courtyard to where she sat. He stood in front of her with his hands at his sides, and the morning sun was behind him, and he looked at her for a moment, in the way he had in the way station, not the cataloguing look, not the strategic look, but the other one, the one that had no official category. The mark site would come later, the claiming would come later, the formal bond, and the announcement, and everything that the pack law required for the mating of a king would come later, with time and consent, and the dignity she was owed, and he understood this, and his wolf understood this, and neither of them pushed. But the wolves in the courtyard were already stepping back, very slightly, as they had the first time, and Pell looked up from his stone line and regarded Leander with the solemn assessment of a 4-year-old who has decided to take someone seriously. "Do you have stones?" Pell asked. Leander reached into his coat pocket. He had, as it happened, been carrying a small piece of white quartz for the past 2 days, a habit from his garrison childhood, from the field commander who had taught him the same principles Naira's father had taught her. He set it on the stone surface at the end of Pell's line, just past the carved dog. Pell examined it. "It has something in it," he said. "It does," Leander said. "What?" "I'm not sure yet," Leander said. "I've been waiting to find out." Pell nodded. He moved the stone to the beginning of the line, not the end, and rearranged several others around it with the decisive authority of someone who has seen the correct order clearly. Naira watched this. She said nothing. Her left foot, wrapped and splinted, rested on the stone block, and the morning was cold and bright and clear, and the census convoy was arriving at the village's eastern gate with its riders and its registry books, and in those books, before the day was out, Pell's name would be written with all the protections the law could give him, and her name beside his, and everything she had spent 3 years holding in place, by silence and counting, and the kind of endurance that does not announce itself, would be held, from now on, by something sturdier than her own hands. She looked at Leander. He looked at her. The wind moved between them and brought him nothing new, just the same thing it had been bringing him since the North Road, the same compound of strength and long patience, and a warmth she had been keeping very close and very quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for last night. For a fire and a bandage," he said. "You walked 3 miles in the dark on a broken foot carrying a child. Don't thank me for a fire." She did not smile. She considered the remark for a moment, as she considered everything, with the exact weight it deserved and no more. Then she said, "For coming north yourself, you didn't have to." "No," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't." She held the look. She let it mean what it meant. Then she looked down at Pell, who had finished his rearrangement and was explaining the result to the carved wooden dog with the patience of someone expecting it to eventually understand. "Roads go somewhere," she said, half to herself. "They do," Leander said. A month passed, then 3. The bond did not rush itself. It built the way solid things build, layer by layer, from the ground, tested at each layer before the next was laid. There were evenings in the capital where she sat at his work table while he read dispatches and she read the census registry documents she was helping to reorganize, because it had become apparent within the first 2 weeks that she had a mind for systemic pattern recognition that his chief archivist had never seen in a non-trained reader, and she used it, quietly and practically, the way she used everything she knew. There were mornings when Pell rearranged the objects on the king's study shelf with the same decisive system he applied to everything, and Leander let him, and found the resulting order, inexplicably, easier to navigate than the one before it. The claiming came in the early spring, private and without ceremony, because she had asked for it that way, and it was what the claiming was supposed to be, a bond completed by mutual full consent, in warmth, without performance. Afterward, the mark at his throat ached with her proximity, in the specific, permanent way of things that have found their right place, and her breath against his shoulder was steady and deliberate, and outside the window, the first real warmth of the year was moving through the capital like something remembered. The wolves in the formal hall registered the change the next morning before the announcement was made. They registered it through her scent and his bearing and the particular way the senior guard opened the hall door when she approached, a door that had not been opened that way for anyone before and would not be opened any other way again. No one announced this. No one needed to. The pack witnessed. The spring moved into summer, and the summer settled, and in the king's study on a warm morning with the windows open, Pell sat on the floor with his entire stone collection, arranged in a pattern that covered most of the available floor space, and the carved wooden dog at the center of it. And he was adding to the system a new piece, a chip of gray granite with a white quartz inclusion that ran through it in a clear, straight line. Naira sat in the chair by the window, with a census registry open across her knees, and Leander sat at the work table 6 feet away, and from where she sat, she could see both of them, the man at the table and the boy on the floor, and the morning light came in clean and unhurried over everything. And all of it, the stones roads, the open windows, the particular quiet of a place where the weight was no longer hers alone to carry, sat exactly where it was supposed to be. The stone had something in it. They were still finding out what.